Did anybody hear the thing I just said, or was I muted and telling everybody about how the meeting is going to go right now?
I did not hear it.
I think you were muted.
The meeting is now recorded. Thank you all for joining us tonight, because SEQR is such an important asking everybody to keep themselves muted. Thank you. Until or unless you have a specific question you'd like to ask. We're going to try and keep the questions in the chat box during the presentation because there are so many participants tonight. Thank you all for coming. And if you have an opportunity to give a question that you'd like to ask during a question portion, please unmute yourself and maybe raise your hand and we'll call on you. So our evening presenter tonight is Alexandra from LaBella. She has several years of experience working in SEQR, and she's prepared this excellent presentation for us. So please, everybody, go ahead and mute yourself unless you have a specific comment. And Alexandra, if you could mute those few remaining people before you start, that might make things easier. Thanks so much.
All right, I'm just looking to see. Looks like there's just maybe a couple people who aren't muted. Okay, if I missed anyone, please mute yourself if you don't mind. Thank you to Victoria for having me. Hopefully this doesn't, bore you guys on a Wednesday night, but try to keep it fairly brief and just kind of do an overview of SEQR, and maybe you'll be able to pick up some tidbits that you didn't already know. As Victoria said, I'm Alex, and I've been working in environmental consulting for about 5 years now. I specialize in SEQR as well as NEPA environmental reviews. This, of course, is just focusing on SEQR and some of the other environmental laws and regulations that go along with it. So I will jump right in, and it's just going to be a pretty basic overview, and I'll try to relate it as much as possible to what you folks might come across on, a planning board or any other boards you might be on. So to get started, as I said, there are some other environmental regulations that kind of fall under the umbrella of SEQR that we deal with every day. So, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with many of these. As I mentioned, NEPA, which is essentially the federal equivalent to SEQR, is something that at a municipality level, you probably wouldn't be dealing with frequently. However, there are times where if there's a federal funding involved, a project might require a NEPA review as well. That could be done at the same time as a SEQR review. There's other kind of some jargon that you might be familiar with, which Article 10 and 7 and Section 94C, which come up frequently with large scale utility, renewable energy utility projects. Many of you probably are familiar with the State Historic Preservation Act. A lot of projects end up getting involved with SHPO. And then you have, Endangered Species Acts, Ag and Markets Law, and there's many others depending on the project. Usually you start to see the same ones over and over again, particularly if you're in a more rural area. You're probably quite familiar with complying with various ag and markets regulations. So as I mentioned earlier, SEQR is a process. So we always try to tell folks to think of it as a process rather than just a permit. It's not just, as simple as submitting an application and checking a box, having it be approved by a state agency. Really, the whole goal of it is to be able to look at all the environmental impacts a project might have, with the ultimate goal is to make sure the project can take these impacts and factors into consideration, so that you're not having a project constructed in your town or village that goes against what your goals are as a community for the environment. So basically, just with the mindset of thinking of it as a process, I've broken it up into a few different steps to kind of simplify it, hopefully, for everyone. So as I said, SEQR ensures environmental impacts are considered. So it should be started from the very beginning of a project. So that way, by the time you get a site plan application or, a zoning variance application, these environmental impacts have already been considered, and those are filled out on one of the forms that you would be getting. And you'll already have a good start when you need to fill out the remaining forms and make a determination on behalf of your municipality. So one thing to keep in mind is with SEQR, it's a government entity, some type of planning board, could be zoning board, town board, an IDA, it could be a county planning board. Those are the groups that would be technically responsible for complying with SEQR. So it's not so much on someone who's applying for a permit, it's really on the municipality. So, the goal, which is pretty obvious, it's SEQR, so it's environmental, to consider the environment and the community as a whole when you're in the process of planning a project. Now, ideally, SEQR is already underway when someone is applying for these permits, and these permits, whether it be typically what I deal with, every day is site plan approval. Those are just super common, and really no permits can be issued without that SEQR being completed for the most part. So it's very important to keep that in mind. I know sometimes developers, maybe tend to kind of push SEQR to the side, but really it should be kind of at the forefront, making sure everything's lined up and all the ducks are in a row before a planning board, for instance, is considering issuing any type of permit. I will talk through the various forms involved with SEQR, as well as some of the DEC guidance. They have these really great online workbooks that are extremely helpful and I think very user-friendly. So I will get into that a little bit later. We always get the question, do I need to do SEQR? Sometimes people from towns calling us, engineers, architects. Everyone always wants to know, when is SEQR required? How do we figure that out? So essentially, with every single project, it should be one of the first thoughts. You have to think about whether or not SEQR is required before you get going on it. So the easiest way to think of it is anytime there is an action, a project or an action, it doesn't have to be a physical action. It could be, something such as revising a zoning code or something like that. If it meets certain thresholds, that would require a SEQR review. So anytime a state or local agency is considering approving an action, undertaking an action themselves, or granting funding for an action that someone else is applying for, SEQR would be required. There are some exceptions. Many of you might be familiar with the term a type 2 action. Those are actions that the DEC has determined to be not requiring a SEQR review. There's a pretty long list. It's fairly extensive. I think it's about 45 different actions now, and those were updated in 2019. They've actually added a lot more. So the goal of that is to kind of streamline the SEQR process. If there's certain actions that, the DEC is saying, these really don't need to be under scrutiny. They're, fairly small with their impact. Those, they're a type 2 action and you're done with SEQR. You're not doing a full SEQR review. I'll get into some of the details on that in a bit. Another exception when SEQR wouldn't be required is if a board is issuing only like a recommendation or a referral, they're not actually issuing an approval or a permit. And then lastly, as I mentioned in the very beginning, New York State Public Service Law, Article 7 or 10 or Section 94C, those refer to large-scale renewable energy projects. It's basically a different process that you don't have to do SEQR in addition to that. It kind of, it overrules SEQR essentially, but it's still a state level environmental review. So essentially, when you're asking yourself this question, whether or not SEQR is required, if you meet any of those criteria, those exceptions on the previous page, then you're saying no, it's not required, and then you're essentially done. It is good practice to keep a record of your determination. Oftentimes we'll see a municipality, like a board of some sort, issuing or passing a type 2 action resolution, just a simple one-page resolution explaining that SEQR was considered for this project and why it is exempt from SEQR review. It's just good practice, but not required legally. So on the other hand, if you determine that a SEQR review is necessary, you, or in theory, more likely a developer, would be filling out the Part 1 environmental assessment form, or the EAF, to identify potential environmental impacts. Now, kind of the last step of that would be if there are significant impacts identified, you would then be moving on to the step or process of writing an environmental impact statement. Usually a project would have to be fairly complex or have a pretty substantial impact on the environment to get to that level. But day-to-day projects, commercial developments, residential subdivisions, stuff like that, you're probably not going to be getting to that point. environmental impact statements can take years. And a lot of times it's just not worth a developer's time to go through that whole process unless it's a pretty large scale major project. So this was something I mentioned briefly about what constitutes an action as far as SEQR goes. It doesn't have to be a physical, digging in the dirt to construct a building. It could also refer to some type of agency that is adopting a new regulation or, updating their zoning code, making a new local law, something along those lines. So that's just kind of an aside. One other thing that another kind of some SEQR jargon is the term segmentation. This just refers to a project or a set of activities that are broken apart and undergo separate environmental reviews, but they're really part of one larger overall project. Segmentation's a no-no with SEQR because the whole point of SEQR is to really look at environmental impacts as a whole on a kind of a broad scale. So, we don't want to be looking at just small little portions of a project because, a bunch of small projects here and there might not have much of an impact, but when you're talking about the entirety of those little mini projects, it could have a fairly significant impact on the local environment. So there's 5 steps broken down here to try to, they don't always have to necessarily go in this order, but this is kind of the best I could do to put them in somewhat of an order. So the first step when conducting a SEQR review would be to identify the lead agency and then also other involved agencies and or interested agencies. So the lead agency would be a single agency that is involved in the project, that the lead agency is selected by others to conduct a single environmental review on their behalf. Now, other involved agencies would be agencies that might be funding or approving or issuing a permit of some sort for a project. But the key is that those agencies would have to have some sort of discretionary approval. So we're not talking about just, approving a building permit. That would not be a discretionary approval. So the last kind of group of agency type would be interested agencies. Now, these are agencies that they're not funding or approving a project or undertaking an action. However, they might be, issuing some type of guidance or suggestions. It could be, some group that, has a particular interest in preserving a watershed area or something like that. They're a special interest group. They might want to be, somewhat involved in the process and aware of what's going on, but they don't actually have, a formal involvement in the project. So these are the 5 steps, basically, when you're starting a SEQR process. Now, this could be someone applying to, say, a town planning board for site plan approval. Maybe a developer or an engineer is starting this process. However, the burden falls on that municipality to identify the lead agency. So, an applicant might suggest who they think would be the lead agency, but it would be on the, say the planning board to formally identify who they believe should act as the lead agency. That lead agency must have an official approval discretionary decision. So in this example, it would be a site plan approval that a town planning board would be issuing. So the lead agency is then formally established. You would circulate part 1 of the environmental assessment form to any other involved agencies and potentially interested agencies as well, if you were going to be coordinating with them for the review. When you're doing that, you're also mentioning how you plan to classify the action under SEQR and why. And then lastly, like I said, you would include either the long or the short environmental assessment form, depending on the level of SEQR review required. So when we talk about the decision type, we have discretionary, which are the decisions that or approvals that the involved agencies would be making. And then you also have administrative or ministerial, which are approvals that the kind of like a special interest group might be issuing. So for discretionary approvals, we have some examples listed here. So I already mentioned it, a town board site plan approval would be one. A change in the zoning code might be one, or funding. Those would be, if you're providing funding for a project, that would also be a discretionary approval. The other set, this administrative or ministerial, some examples of that would be a building permit, as I mentioned. Another one is a SWIP, which sometimes has been argued that it is a discretionary approval, but the DEC has been pretty clear that they consider a SWIP, a stormwater pollution prevention plan, to be an administrative approval, not discretionary. So that's kind of how we treat them. There have been some attorneys who have tried to argue it, and not quite. I guess it probably depends on the person, but for the most part, a SWIP, something like that, there's not really judgment involved. You kind of either meet certain criteria or you don't. So those are building permit and SWIPs are two really common approvals that we would kind of list under a SEQR review as being, a requirement, but not a discretionary approval. So in that case, for a SWIP, you might include the DEC as just an interested agency if you're going to do a coordinated review. So the third step in this whole process, like I said, is the coordination. So when you have an agency that's saying they believe they should be the lead agency for this project, if there are other agencies that are involved with issuing certain approvals, certain discretionary approvals, you would have to conduct the SEQR review as a coordinated review, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's coordinating with the other agencies. So down here, it kind of shows the difference between coordinated and uncoordinated reviews. So the coordinated review involves a 30-day coordination period. Once the part 1 of the SEQR form is circulated to those agencies, there's a 30-day, essentially it's like a waiting period where you have, you give these other agencies time to respond if they have any comments. The 30-day period is essentially just technically for other agencies to say if they have an issue with you being the lead agency. Usually that doesn't happen because agencies usually try to avoid being the lead agency if they're not super involved with a project, because it's more of a burden on them. This coordinated review is not always required though. The only time that it is required is for type 1 actions under SEQR, which I will get into later. For unlisted actions, this coordinated review is optional. It's really kind of up to your discretion. If it's a pretty, simple project that you don't see being a real issue in your local area, it would probably be safe to do an uncoordinated review. However, if you're talking about a project that might, be somewhat controversial, it's probably a safe bet to do the coordinated review when given the option. The uncoordinated review, there is no 30-day, coordination period. And as I mentioned, it only is applicable for unlisted actions under SEQR. So here, classifying the action, as I've mentioned, there's kind of three main types of actions under SEQR. You have type 1, which are type 1 actions are the kind of big, larger scale projects. The most common threshold criteria that we automatically think of when we think of type 1 actions is a physical alteration of 10 or more acres of land. That seems to be kind of the first go-to when you're looking at a project. Your thought is, okay, well, how much of an area is this disturbing? If you're over 10 acres, automatically, it's going to be a type 1 action, meaning it's going to require that long environmental assessment form and a coordinated review. There are, many other criteria as well. These are just some of them. There is a full sheet that I believe will be available to everyone after I just kind of PDF from, I think it's the Cornell Law website. I just snipped the whole listing of them. That is fairly helpful. I reference that frequently when it comes to determining the level of review. So anything that doesn't fit under the type 1 action could be listed as a type 2 action, which are those that are already predetermined by the DEC to not have a significant environmental impact. Some common examples of those are maintenance or repair, replacement in kind of a structure or something like that. Another one that that comes in handy is construction or expansion of non-residential structures by less than 4,000 square feet. We see that a lot with, businesses might be adding on a small addition of some sort. They don't need to go through the whole SEQR process for that, because it's considered to be a minor action that falls under this type 2 threshold. So those type 2 actions, you don't need to do SEQR for. Any other actions, though, that don't fall under the type 1 list or the type 2 list, everything else is considered unlisted. And unlisted actions do require SEQR. It is up to the lead agency on how they would like to handle that, whether or not they want to do a long form or a short form, or if they will do a coordinated review or an uncoordinated review. A lot of that will just kind of come down to preference and kind of like how the project is perceived by the municipality, the surrounding area, whether or not there could be sensitive environmental resources in the area. things that might require a closer look, a deeper dive, your best bet is to do the long form. I didn't mention this earlier, but they are listed here under the type 1 actions, those larger scale projects. Some of the other common things that end up triggering type 1 review is if you have a project that's proposed, say it's in a state agricultural district, or it's adjacent to parkland, or it's in a historical district in your town. Those things end up changing that, 10-acre threshold significantly. So I don't have the exact numbers here, but I know for sure the agricultural district and the historic district, I believe that 10-acre threshold gets lowered to 2.5 acres. So it's a 75% reduction. So anytime you're in an area that might have some sort of sensitive, whether it be an ag district, some type of historic structure, parkland, those should be red flags to just kind of take a closer look and double check to make sure that you are conducting the proper level of SEQR review. So here it's the same thing, type 1 list, unlisted actions, and type 2 list. And then this just breaks down the steps involved, essentially whether or not a review is required, what form you would fill out, whether or not you're doing a coordinated review or not, and then just the likelihood that it would require an environmental impact statement. We also have a SEQR cheat sheet that I sent to Victoria that I believe has this listed on it. So that can come in handy. I am going to go back though. So this, I think it was, here, when we're talking about classifying the action, we have a little exercise. I'm not sure the best way to do it, if people maybe want to write in the chat box. Well, it looks like we have some questions. So someone asked, type 2 does not need to have a SEQR. Is this correct? Yes, that is correct. Type 2 actions do not require SEQR review. However, it is good practice to just document this in on the record. It could be just writing up a memo for your files, or it could be passing a short resolution just explaining that SEQR was considered and why it's not required. So anyways, in the chat box, oh yeah, and feel free to share anything, Victoria. Sorry, I'm just seeing these messages now. So in the chat box, I'm thinking maybe what I can do is I will kind of read out a scenario where and then you guys can write in the box whether or not you would think it would be a type 1 action, a type 2 action, or an unlisted action. There's a whole sheet of them. Maybe we'll just do a few of them, see if we can get like a somewhat of a variety. So let's see. Okay, so the first one we have here. A developer proposes a new shopping mall with 850 parking spaces and new utility line extensions on a 25-acre site. So we have a new development on a 25-acre site. Any ideas on whether or not that would be type 1 action, type 2, or unlisted? Seeing type 1, type 2. Seeing mostly type 1. Yep, that would be a type 1 action, simply just based on the fact that you're talking about a 25-acre site. We can assume that that would involve more than 10 acres of ground disturbance. When you're taking into consideration the parking lot, that's a pretty big parking lot. And obviously utility lines, it all adds up quickly. So we're saying, someone asked, what if the area is rural and has no zoning? So even if there's no zoning, it would still be subject to SEQR review. I think there wouldn't be any, variances or anything that you would require if there's no zoning code. But even if there's,
Could we say
sorry?
that the element of the local government that has to make a determination then runs SEQR? If it's not a zoning law, then it could be whomever's in charge of handling the curb cuts and making sure that the stormwater flows off the site is correct. So if they live in a place where there's no rules at all, that place doesn't exist in New York State. Where some rules apply, the element of the government that is applying those rules and making the determination is the one that goes through and executes SEQR, even if there is no zoning in your town.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'll do another example. Let's see. So how about replacement of a ruptured water main in the city of Corning within the paved street or sidewalk portion of the right of way? So we have replacement of water main within the existing right of way. So I'm seeing a lot of type 2 actions. That's correct. It would be considered maintenance or repair. And it would fall under that type 2 threshold, meaning SEQR would not be required for that. Let's see, here's another one. So construction of a 3,000 square foot addition to the County Department of Social Services building for after-school programming in the city of Elmira. So construction of a 3,000 square foot addition to a commercial building. Lots of type 2, yep. You guys are fast. Yep, that would be a type 2. One thing to keep in mind for that is it would be a type 2 so long as there's no, other zoning issues that might require a type 1 review, or if it's in a historic district downtown, that could lower that threshold, that 4,000 square foot threshold. So just things to keep in mind, but that would most likely be a type 2 action.
So since we're talking about this specific type 2 exemption, say you receive the application and you say this is type 2, we're not dealing with it, SEQR is done. And then they come back 9 months later, 15 months later, with another application that would have put them over the threshold. Do you then review the whole thing as a type 1, or you take it again as that type 2?
That kind of
each one would have been below the threshold, but combined.
Right. So in theory, you could review them separately. This comes up a lot when we do, or at least I work on a lot of school district projects, and school districts are always doing new improvements and building additions and whatnot. And a lot of times, we will defer to the district's SEQR attorney. Now, obviously, some bigger municipalities might have their own SEQR attorney, however, many don't. So it's up to you, but I would say there's nothing in the regulations that's in the SEQR regulations that say you would have to revisit the original project. It's just it might be something just to note though, if there is some real concern about it, I would think that it might be something you want to look into more. Looks like there's a question here. If you had an existing structure that was originally a type 1 project and is now going to be renovated or expanded, is it still a type 1 or could it be a type 2? So if I think that means like if the project changes, like the project scope changes and is now only going to require a type 2 action.
I read that to say something big, like a mall or a new school goes in. That would have been a type 1 action. And now
Right.
it's some
I
renovation.
unmuted. Can I clarify?
Sure.
Yeah, so I guess in the case of a mall or something, if you had a mall that obviously was a type 1, or maybe even there was something that was near a parkland or something that originally fell under a type 1 where you had to do a full environmental SEQR form for it. And then in the future, the project has been completed. In the future, they decided they want to do a renovation and or expansion. Would it immediately still be a type 1, or is it situational dependent?
Yeah, so thank you for clarifying that. That's a good question. I would say that those additional, if there's an addition, expansion, or other renovations down the road, I mean, if it's a month later and you're still kind of in the SEQR process, that would be different. But if the SEQR review has already been completed, and it's, maybe a year or two later, I would say that so long as it meets type 2 criteria, then you could consider those renovations a type 2 action, even though the development itself was a type 1 action. Okay, let's see, maybe do 1 or 2 more. Let's see if I can find one to trick people. Okay, let's see. Oh, here's a good one. This one I have not mentioned in this presentation. It's pretty specific. So let's see. If you have installation of 12,000 linear feet of water main in the village of Montour Falls, so you have installation of water main. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Okay, looks like we have a mix here of type 1 and unlisted. So at first glance, obviously that's not mentioned on either of those lists. So so unlisted would make sense. However, when you're talking about water main, installing new water main, the New York State Department of Health actually has their own type 1 list of actions. So anytime you're dealing with a water main project, you always are going to want to get in contact with the Department of Health to make sure you're conducting the appropriate SEQR review. In this case, it would actually be a type 1 action. We've had different projects where we've gone back and forth with the Department of Health, and they've been able to kind of help guide us on what level of review. Oh, someone have a question? Oh, maybe not. So anyways, those can be tricky sometimes when it comes to SEQR. So, I see no harm in trying to reach out to the Department of Health just to check to make sure you're kind of doing everything properly so that you don't get held up down the road trying to get certain permits from the state. Okay, let's do one more. So let's see. Development of a light industrial / high-tech park on a 9.8 acre parcel in the city of Hornell, near but not adjacent to a historic district. So you have development, commercial development, 9.8 acres, city of Hornell, and it's adjacent to a historic district. So a lot of people, someone from Hornell, type 1, everyone's saying type 1. Oh, we have some unlisted, type 2, type 1. So in this case, it would technically be an unlisted action under SEQR. However, given the fact that you're talking about 9.8 acres of land, you're very close to that 10-acre threshold, and you're not in a historic district, but or adjacent to it, but you're nearby, it would be an unlisted action. However, we would always recommend filling out that long environmental assessment form. Just, to be thorough, make sure you're not overlooking anything. So that would be better safe than sorry in a case like that, when you're really close to one of those thresholds. All right, so I'm gonna there's a full list with answers on it that Victoria will provide, I believe, at the end of this presentation. I think there's 12 of them listed. So that will be maybe a helpful reference for you guys. Let's see. So back to the presentation. Okay. So we got to that last step, step 5, when you're actually filling out the environmental assessment form. And now I'll dig a little bit deeper into the nitty-gritty of the forms themselves, as well as the SEQR workbooks, which are super helpful. And then the online mapper. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with these, but the DEC does, add things occasionally and revamp. So it's just a kind of good refresher, I guess. So the SEQR forms, you have the short and the full forms, or sometimes it's called the long form. Those are all available on the DEC website, and they're just PDF, like fillable forms that you can download. Pretty simple to use. The short form is only 3 pages, and the full form is, I think, 13. So, the full form is definitely a lot more in depth. So for those, more complex projects, even if it is an unlisted action, it can be very helpful. Sometimes for certain types of actions or criteria, planning boards, or I guess typically planning boards, will actually just require that an applicant fill out a long form, and that's kind of up to the municipality, what they want to require for unlisted actions. So the next item here is the EAF workbook. So the DEC, some of you might be familiar with the old school. There was the SEQR cookbook. The DEC basically a few years ago revamped everything, put everything online. So step by step, how to answer every single question on the forms is online, and it's many of them have an explanation of kind of the reasoning behind the question, as well as examples, which is very helpful. I'll get into that shortly. And then the last item here is the EAF mapper, the environmental assessment form mapper. So that's basically just an online mapping system that the DEC operates, and it includes information from many different databases that the state has. So it looks at, agricultural districts, it looks at, contamination sites, it looks at floodplains, wetlands. Now, they're not always 100% accurate, so, take it for what it's worth, but it's definitely a really good screening tool when you're filling out an environmental assessment form. And if we're working with municipalities to help them with SEQR reviews, there are times where they might get an application that doesn't include the generated EAF mapper summary page, and we'll actually, request that from the applicant just to make sure we have the full picture of everything. The DEC has issued some guidance, basically saying that if you get a yes response on one of these generated forms, saying, for instance, yes, you have a wetland on your site. If you can prove otherwise, because the maps are not always super accurate, if you can show, hey, there's a wetland nearby, but, the development area is, over here, it's 1,000 feet away, you can override that, yes answer, and, make a note explaining that. The DEC has also said that if you get a no response, those can be taken on faith and without further examination. Do with that what you want. I usually still like to check. I mean, if there's a wetland or some other sensitive area on a site, it's worthwhile, I would say, to look into it a bit more if you're concerned. So more often than not, a planning board or a zoning board or a town board, they're going to be receiving a part 1, whether it be a short form or a long form, that is already filled out by an applicant. So not only are you going to be checking that, essentially making sure it's all correct, you're also then going to be filling out the part 2 and 3, which the main goals of the part 2 and 3 are to identify impacts and then figure out, well, is this a small impact? Is this a large impact? Kind of how to categorize it and the significance that it might have, in your local area on the environment. So on the part 2 form, I think, did I save them here? Oh, okay, I'll backtrack a little bit. So this was the page where you can get all of the forms that you can download on the you can just Google DEC SEQR forms and you'll find it. This is a snippet of just the first page of the part 1 short form. This one is only 4 pages. You'll see, it's basic project information on the first page. It's pretty brief. It's not like a deep dive really. So for unlisted actions, the DEC says to use the short form whenever you can, just for the sake of streamlining the process. However, you cannot use the short form for type 1 actions. So, and then again, as I mentioned, these are typically filled out by the applicant. It could be filled out by a municipality though, if it's a public works project, a water main, sewer, wastewater treatment plant, anything like that, a road project. In that case, the municipality would be filling out actually parts 1, 2, and 3. We work with municipalities a lot to handle their SEQR reviews for them, essentially. And then the part 2 here, again, this is from the short form, not the long form. This is where you're going to identify, okay, are these impacts, is there no impact or small impact, or are there moderate or large impacts? So I'll backtrack a little bit to my page here. When you're trying to figure out, okay, well, how do you know if it's small or moderate? I mean, it's pretty, subjective. That's when the DEC workbooks come into play. So the DEC workbook, for every single question in the part 2, it will show you, it'll have an explanation of the question and kind of the meaning behind it, what they're trying to get at. And it'll show you examples of just a bulleted list of what are small impacts and then what might fall under the moderate to large impact category. Some things to keep in mind, there is some gray area. Not every single thing is spelled out. When you're trying to figure out what, is this small or moderate to large, take into consideration the setting, like where the project is, how likely is this to be an issue? Is it irreversible? Are you permanently converting agricultural land to an industrial use, or is it just, a temporary, maybe for a year, there'll be construction staging in an agricultural use area. And then also the number of people affected. So if you're in a super rural area and you're going to be working on the roads or changing the roadway or some intersection, say, is this going to be affecting 100 people a day or 2,000 people a day? It's just kind of try to put it into perspective on how is this going to have an overall impact on the community. Some of them, like I said, are pretty easy. You either meet a certain criteria that would put you in a small impact or moderate to large impact or not. But there are some that are more subjective, and there's always gray area when it comes to SEQR. Okay, so, and then in the part 3, you're essentially explaining the reasoning behind why you picked what in the part 2. So, you're going to check no or small or moderate to large. Now, according to the SEQR guidance, someone asked, where do solar farms fall? Do you mean like what type of action? I'm guessing. Solar, if that's, oh yes, what type of action? So solar farms, which are, popping up literally everywhere now. For the most part, the like 5 megawatt, smaller scale projects are typically type 1 actions, and a developer would fill out a long form of the full environmental assessment form. If you are, if you're constructing a solar farm on a closed landfill or I think a brownfield site, I believe those both fall under the type 2 category. But I mean, for the most part, a lot of these solar farms are being constructed in ag fields. And for the most part, those would be type 1 actions. So the part 3, you are not required to write a narrative unless you identify a moderate to large impact. However, it's kind of just good practice to write even just a brief narrative explaining any relevant ones that, there might have been a small impact. So say, for instance, on this part 2 list, so look at number 5. Will the proposed action result in an adverse change in the existing level of traffic or affect existing infrastructure for mass transit, biking, or walkways? So, there are many projects where there could be a pretty significant interruption in traffic patterns for, a year or more, depending on the size of the project, but there might not be necessarily long-term impacts. So the part 3 should just be considered a discussion, essentially, of what was considered. Did the applicant have a traffic impact study performed by a traffic engineer? If so, maybe you'd want to provide a couple sentences on that and, just reference it. So showing on the record that, these things were considered and, professional consultants determined that something, wouldn't be considered a significant impact.
So as an environmental consultant, I feel like this is a great point to ask, how long does a specific environmental study take? If you are reading through the initial application that you received and you think, there might be some traffic concerns here, or there's going to be a lot of noise pollution, we think we're going to need some additional research from an environmental consultant. How long does that take?
That's a good question. So that really varies a lot. It could be anywhere from a couple weeks to several months, depending on the type of additional review and just how busy things are. I know we have traffic engineers here who do these traffic impact studies all the time. And if they're super busy, there might be a month waiting period before they can even get out in the field to do their stuff. So it really varies. That's why it's kind of, one of the things I mentioned earlier about SEQR is it's always good to get the SEQR process going super early, even if you don't have necessarily a super finalized project scope. If you're able to say, we know right off the bat, traffic is going to be a concern or noise is going to be a concern, you can, get those studies going early. The developers should be getting these things going early. So that way everything's already kind of underway as this SEQR process is unfolding. Obviously say a town planning board, they're, not going to be comfortable issuing a site plan approval and approving SEQR for a project if they have no clue how it's going to impact traffic in the area. So there's really no answer to that other than it varies greatly depending on, the time of year. One thing to consider for more specialized, like species surveys for endangered or threatened species or wetland delineations. Those are also affected by the seasons and the weather. So, they can't do wetland delineations if the ground is frozen. So a lot of times, things will just get put on hold until they can properly conduct whatever type of survey you need for a project. So
and
those
the costs of those are borne by the applicant, right? The community can see the application is partially complete, but they have questions, and asking the applicant to go ahead and pay for the community to hire an engineer is an appropriate use of the applicant's funds, because all of the big applications are going to come in with that extra study already completed. They knew what they were coming into, and they already tried to find out where the eagle's nests were. And and now for someone who's basically, maybe hasn't done a giant SEQR review before, didn't really know what they were getting into, that's when the town can go ahead and say, we think that there needs to be an additional study on this, and we will hire an engineer to do that, but you're going to be the one who pays, just like they pay for a building permit.
Right. Yep. So when we work for, as a consultant, when we work for a municipality, I work with planning boards a lot with our civil engineers who do the site plan review work, and we'll do the SEQR and other environmental work for them. Basically, whatever consultant you hire, they send an invoice to the municipality and that gets passed right on to the applicant. So yeah, it would be the burden of the applicant to pay for all of that. And sometimes, we do see, because we work with developers as well, so we kind of see both sides of things. And a lot of times the developers are really pushing things along. They really want to get something in, on the agenda. So they say, oh, well, this is underway. We haven't done this yet, but it's underway. And, sometimes things kind of get pushed along, even if they're not necessarily complete. And it looks like Nicholas raised their hand. I don't know how to.
He just tell him to unmute himself and then he can lower his hand if he's happy with the
You
answer.
should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, yeah, kind of on the same lines. If you go through the questions here and you read down through and we kind of do your due diligence, obviously we're, zoning boards, planning boards are from all sorts of backgrounds.
Yeah.
Probably not super fluent in environmental policy and you go through and everything you say is a small impact. And during the project construction, somebody hits an underground spring. Where, I just ran it. Something happens that was not necessarily on the surface. You didn't get a consultant, but you went ahead, you approved the project, whatever. So I guess my question is, like, where does the responsibility fall? Does due diligence cover you for, possible repercussions, those kind of things?
I'm going to go with, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm pretty sure she's not either.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm not either. One of the women I work with in my group is, though. I could ask her. I'm trying to think. I guess, if you're realistically, if you're following all of the SEQR guidance and you miss something, I wouldn't think it wouldn't be the burden of the municipality, but it would for sure halt the project if it was that significant. So I'm not quite sure on that one, but I could look into it. I think it would probably depend too on the type of project. Oftentimes, depending on if say you have like a commercial project that's getting financing from a bank, a lot of times the bank would require a phase 1 environmental site assessment, which would not necessarily identify if there was like a natural spring, but would for sure, if there's any potential historic underground oil storage tanks or sketchy other things that might be buried underground from historical uses of a site, those would be identified fairly early on in the project process. But yeah, I could look into it though and get back to you.
I would say that part of the answer has to be based on whether the impacts of the discovery are only borne by the property owner, like in the case of finding a spring.
Right.
You paid your money and take the chances, right? Sometimes there's something on the site comes out poorly, and sometimes it comes out well, right? They could find gold or whatever, and they wouldn't have had to go back to the planning board to tell them what they had found. They just had to bear the cost of their own discovery. But if you find something on the site that does come back right into these SEQR criteria, like artifacts, significant artifacts, or if you been a waste disposal site there, that's something that you'd need to contact somebody to talk about. Yeah,
well, people always freak out when anytime there's any type of artifact that is found. When SHPO gets involved, that can really slow down a project. Not necessarily stop it completely, but that can really put a wrench in a project. So, which is why during the SEQR process, you would be coordinating with SHPO right off the bat to identify, is this an archaeologically sensitive area? They can't say for sure if there's a concern or not, but they can at least issue, an effect finding saying that, there's no known issues in this area. So, again, things can be missed, things can be overlooked, or just, things can pop up that you don't expect. But if you're doing the due diligence and filling out the EAF to the best of your ability, it should be able to catch a lot of things, I would say. Looks like someone else posted a question as well. David Oliver said, the planning board receives an application for expansion of use of a pre-existing non-conforming business in a residential zone. The ZBA gives partial relief contrary to the county planning M239 and the village board OGM application for lake use. Does this require a type 1 review? There's a lot going on in this question. Okay, let's see. The planning board received. So if you have a pre-existing non-conforming business in a residential zone and they're trying to expand that use, it's my understanding that they would be subject to current requirements if they're applying, if it's a new application for an expansion. I'm not sure that this would require, I don't know that this would require a type 1 review though. OGM, I'm not familiar, I don't know what OGM application is. I don't know if you want to add a comment to that. We can come back to that one.
Or you can unmute yourself and explain a little bit more about what the question is.
Let's see. I don't see him here anymore. Oh, office general management for moorings. Huh, okay, well, I'm not familiar with that, but if it's if it's like a state park, if the lakefront is a state park or something like that, maybe then that would be it would require a type 1 review. I would just say that I guess it would depend on whatever the expansion is, would determine whether or not it would be a type 1 action. But I'm not familiar with the moorings thing, the Office of General Management for moorings. So I couldn't say for sure. But I would just revert back to whether or not if the current project scope that's being proposed, if that's a type 1 action, then yes, it would be. So then someone else said, what if you're many miles away from a state park and one discovers? I don't know what that means. Paul DePietro, if you want to unmute yourself and clarify that.
Question is let's say you're many miles away from a state park, maybe battlefield, and all of a sudden you come across something that is in relation to that battlefield that is, many miles away. Does that just all of a sudden shut everything down? It's in relation to question number 8. In other words, you couldn't foresee that, but then all of a sudden it's in relation to that battlefield many miles away.
Yeah. So at that point, so if SHPO was not aware of this area previously, you would be obligated to alert them, I believe. And, you know, they probably, yes, would halt the project to have some sort of archaeological survey conducted of that area, to identify like the extent of it. So it would not be great for your project if that happened, but you know, it also could be some really small thing that's discovered. They do their archaeological digging and research, and you know, it might just be like a small area that's delineated. I've been involved with a project before that there was a small historic graveyard that was discovered, or like a Native American burial ground, I think, that was discovered on a new commercial development. And I don't know how long it took for them to figure this out, but basically the project was still able to move forward. They just had to fence off this area, basically, that was like on the corner of a parking lot. It's, you know, grass over, and they put a sign of some sort. So it's not like it completely stopped the project and shut it down altogether, but you know, there was definitely additional work involved with figuring out what was involved. And you know, it would be up to the state to fund that and do their thing, unless, say, you submit an applicant submits to SHPO, they submit a proposed project, and SHPO comes back right off the bat and says, hey, this area is of concern to us. We're going to recommend a phase 1A archaeological survey. Then the applicant or the developer, whoever is proposing this project, it would be on them to you know, pay for and get this survey done ahead of time. I haven't really had any surveys come back with anything major. Typically, the projects that, at least the ones I've worked on recently, have been able to move forward. But it, you know, again, something like that, an archaeological survey might take a couple months, depending, you know, they can't dig if the ground is frozen solid. So just things to keep in mind when you're getting these additional you know, environmental reviews done for your project.
Hi, I'm the one who has a question. Is this an appropriate time to talk?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay. In my town, we have no zoning, and there is a Dollar General that's sunk because it was built very close to a very wet area. And it's sunk enough that Dollar General abandoned it and went across the street and rebuilt a bigger store on a kind of elevated area.
Ooh,
My
okay.
question is, there's another business that wants to come in, Family Dollar, and build on the old sinking, obviously tear it down. Made me seasick going in there because that was awful. They want to build there, and to me, it's so wet there and mucky and inappropriately on a wet, mucky area that probably was wetland at one point. Is it type 1? Is it kind of don't even start because it's not acceptable to go back and do that again? Can you comment on that?
Well, without knowing the area, I mean, I would be surprised if that wasn't in some type of flood zone. Do you happen to know if it is, like, in a FEMA flood zone?
I'm sure it is, because the flood zone maps changed recently, and doesn't matter if you were ever flooded or not, practically the whole village is, I've been told, I haven't seen them, but
Okay.
supposedly practically all of us are in the flood zone now, and that definitely would be. That
Yeah,
whole
so
area, yeah, is flood zone-ish because whenever it rains significantly, the water spreads out everywhere along that creek.
okay. Yeah, so I'm thinking that, so even though you don't have a zoning code in your village, any proposed project in a flood zone would still be subject to any FEMA requirements and like a review under FEMA's regulations. I'm not super familiar with the specifics of that, but I would say that I don't think a project like that would be approved by, at least by FEMA. I don't think that they would be able to obtain their appropriate or the necessary.
I was disconnected a couple of times.
Sorry, did you have a question too, or you just got back in? I'm just gonna mute him. Okay. So just to finish your question, Sally, I would say that oh yeah, someone commented here. Proper engineering and use of helical piles may work. Yeah, so if FEMA issued some type of like conditional approval that said, you know, that the applicant needed to do X, Y, and Z in order to construct in this particular flood zone, then, you know, it would be up to the applicant to determine whether or not it's worth it for them to do that.
Would that make FEMA I can't remember the exact word, but another agency that has to cooperate and come in, that we have to contact and make sure they're in on it?
Yeah, so that they would be, I believe they would be an involved agency if they're issuing some type of permit or approval.
Well, many of our code enforcement officers do the floodplain evaluations and determining whether or not the site is in the FEMA floodplain or whether it's out of the FEMA floodplain.
Okay.
So if the local code enforcement officer reviews it, if you have questions about flood issues, you can call our office and you'll speak with Janet Thigpen, the floodplain mitigation specialist. She does trainings occasionally. So once that site is then determined, it could just be a locally wet site that was poorly engineered the first time, right? There's a possibility that the site, they just didn't put enough time in and they built it poorly and it's just soggy, but it's not actually a floodplain.
That's right, Victoria.
So if the site is just soggy and it's already been developed once, from a land use perspective, you can look at it and say, well, it's never going to be nature again. It's not a Dollar General anymore either. So if somebody wants to put in all of this fill and the right kind of footings out of their own pocket to solve the site problems, that's one way of evaluating it. But you would go through all of those determinations to find out whether or not you have a zoning law in place. No. But you still are not allowed, nobody's allowed to just build willy-nilly in the floodplain.
Right.
How does your local community handle those floodplain issues?
I'm not sure it is floodplain. I would have to look. This is Elaine Jardine, County Planning Director. I would have to look at the firm map to make sure, but and if it is floodplain, then it would be the code enforcement officer who is also the local floodplain administrator, their jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you.
And someone else just chimed in, Andres Sudfin, said, so would the planning board request the applicant complete a SEQR prior to bringing the plans to the board? I would say yes. Typically the SEQR would be submitted to a planning board along with the site plans. Sometimes we'll submit them beforehand based on, the worst case scenario, but usually it would be at the same time. Cool, okay. These are great questions, making me think on this Wednesday night. And then Chris Longwell commented, an official wetland is defined by more criteria than its water content / saturation. Be careful of describing any wet area as wetland. That's also a very good point. I am not a wetland specialist. However, I work with a lot of them in my group, and they are always explaining the different nuances to what is a wetland and what constitutes a wetland. A lot of times wetlands aren't even that wet. So that's usually a tricky thing. And usually it's always good to default to the professionals when you're working on something like that. If you're not super familiar with something like that, with different water resources, whether it be wetlands or floodplains. And it sounds like, you know, the county has a lot of great resources as well. So, okay. Well, I think I don't have that much more left in the presentation. Kind of already talked through the part 2 and 3, essentially just describing, and a lot of these questions that folks have been asking are good things to discuss in the part 3 narrative. You want the part 3 narrative to be, you know, easy enough to understand that, you know, a resident reading it would understand what the village or the town took into consideration with a particular project. And then one last item here is the EAF mapper that I mentioned. Sure, you guys are probably familiar with this, but the DEC has this mapper on their site, and it's not always 100% accurate, but it's a good just screening tool right off the bat, especially if you want to dig a little bit deeper into a certain like sensitive resource on a project site. The DEC, for each of the different categories that they automatically fill in on the environmental assessment form, there's usually a separate like mapping website that goes along with it that will give you a little bit more detail on like types of wetlands or types of endangered species, kind of not super in depth, but a little bit more to go off of. That will also generate, you'll see at the bottom, full form or short form, it'll generate the actual environmental assessment form with a summary page at the very end. And then basically just kind of reiterating what we talked about. If you are, you know, you have a project that someone has submitted for site plan approval or something like that, if you're somewhat out of your element, you're unsure, it's always worth it to reach out to your county planning department. They can oftentimes provide some guidance on, you know, even just where to find certain information. If it's a pretty, you know, high stakes project, definitely the town or like villages or cities attorney would, you know, probably need to get involved, especially when it comes to controversial projects. It's always good to have an attorney making sure, you know, all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. And then lastly, you know, you can hire private consultants to assist with the SEQR process. Sometimes it's an engineer who might be familiar, who might be doing site plan reviews for you and SEQR, or, you know, maybe you just need an environmental consultant to help out on some of the larger, you know, more complex projects. As I said, you know, for large projects or controversial projects, and then also to, we've sometimes in the past, if county, or sorry, if a town or village has a lot of new planning board members, we've helped out with kind of training. So sometimes consultants can help out just for a short period of time with training on, maybe we'll assist with a few projects to kind of get you going. It's always worth at least reaching out if you have a working relationship with, an engineer or an architect that you trust and like working with. A lot of times they'll have an environmental professional or more, an environmental division of a company or whatnot, that is able to kind of assist and just, even if it's just here and there, with some of the more complex projects. So, and then just kind of, here's a little short summary slide, which is what was also in the beginning of the presentation, that just kind of gives the who, what, or the who, why, when, and how of SEQR. And that is it. I don't know, people have been asking really good questions this whole time. I don't know if anyone has more questions that they want to type in or unmute themselves and ask. If anyone has any other questions, I can also, my email is here. My colleague Francis, who is an attorney, actually the one I was talking about, you can feel free to email us if you do have questions. We're happy to help if we can point you in the right direction or whatnot.
Hi, this is Nick again.
Hi.
I kind of have a question. So
Okay.
how much does changing your comprehensive plan affect the way you look at SEQR? Does it change? I mean, obviously with, if you rezone an agricultural to a residential or commercial, there's changes, but what about like, I can't remember what the specific name is, but there was something with green communities and some of that stuff. Does that change the way you look at SEQR, or is it just a name?
It's more of a kind of a guide, like guidance. It wouldn't necessarily be set in stone. But if your town comes up with certain, additional requirements that they want to take into consideration for future development, I mean, it would be in your best interest to kind of go along with that if it's what your town came up with on their own. I would say for the most part, though, if we're filling out like a part 1 environmental assessment form, usually, we will look at the comprehensive plan if there is one, just kind of for guidance to get an overall idea of, where the town or village sees itself going moving forward with future projects. I don't know if that answered your question. It's pretty much more just a guide.
No, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, and then it looks like there's some more in the text in the chat box here. Gregory said, does a general revision of the local land use regulation require SEQR? That is a good question. So
I believe that's a strong yes.
So for any zoning regulation change, you would have to consider SEQR. Whether or not it would be a type 1 action or not would depend on the extent of the zoning change, like what portion of the town or village or city is affected. Usually though, unless it's something super minor, usually it's a type 1 action though under SEQR.
Just so you know, I'm the guy that said, hey, I'm from Hornell. So this is very definitely an agricultural community, and we don't necessarily see any major changes in our environment but I am in the process of reviewing and potentially updating the land use regulations and comprehensive plan for the town as a routine matter. And I don't see any major, I don't see much of anything that would be a change in our agricultural status. If anything, it would be a matter of simply administrative function changes. So I'm wondering if, I guess do I, is it just a judgmental call of like, hey, I don't see anything that's going to be changing our agricultural status or impacting our agricultural community. I don't see any major changes in our way of doing business on a day-to-day basis. So
Yeah.
I guess.
So I've done this. I worked on one last year with a fairly rural town that has a lot of agricultural areas, and they had, it was, a handful of changes, nothing, super major. And I think we treated it as a type 1 action, but the majority of the form was not applicable. So you're essentially filling out the long form, but you'll see on I don't know what page it is. It might be the second page, I think. There's a question where it asks if it is like administrative only, and a lot of the other questions aren't applicable. And then in the part 3 narrative, we basically just explained the changes to the zoning code, and they weren't anything that would have like a significant environmental impact by putting them into place. So yes, you'd still be doing it, treating it as a type 1 action, but the majority of the questions in the form are not applicable. So you wouldn't really be filling out the entire form.
Yeah, the biggest changes I see are things that are related to renewable energy resources.
Okay,
And
yeah.
a lot of those things are already covered under state statutes.
Okay. Yeah, so I think it sounds like it's mostly a lot of the questions would not be applicable to you. So you wouldn't be answering them. But you would still
So
be
if I go
filling
through
it.
the entire form and everything is not applicable, do I actually have to fill out the form? Do I actually have to submit the form at all?
I believe you would.
It feels
That
strange
doesn't make
when you
sense.
do it.
That doesn't make sense. If I go through it, and why am I filling out the form?
And then you, not only do you fill it out, you have to file it with the ENB,
Oh,
right?
Okay,
You-
you're
it
gonna have
goes
to explain
through
this
the
one to me from
notice.
a logic standpoint.
It's New
Everything's
York State, man.
NA.
Don't
Still have
don't
to
break your
submit the
brain.
thing.
Don't break your brain
Huh?
trying to think your way through a New York State rule. You have to SEQR, and they say complete it completely. You go NA, or small to moderate. Because if you are making land use changes, there might be some small to moderate changes, but those changes are entirely consistent with the long-term plan for the community, and we accept them, and it's fine. And you complete the action, and you file the forms, and you've done your due diligence.
Okay, I'm a Six Sigma expert, and you know what we call that?
Give it to me. What is it called? I'll write it down.
Non-value added activity.
Okay.
There's a lot of state regulations like that.
That we are paying for in our taxes.
Well, SEQR is
Non-value
administered
added
locally.
tax-based covered items.
So
Where do I fight back?
SEQR is administered locally, so you can just try and process your SEQRs as efficiently as possible.
The fact that I have to submit it at all is inefficient, period. If it's all not applicable, why do I have to submit it at all? That's not efficient, it's non-value added, period.
I hear you.
Yeah, I get that. I'm not feeling the warm and fuzzy feeling when I hear you.
I've gone through the same process myself, and it's difficult to go through it and say, now remember, we're saying if this is applicable or not applicable to the action of changing the law on a piece of paper, and it's not applicable. The action that we're doing, changing the law on the piece of paper, is not applicable. And it is difficult, but it's our job to provide training to you so you know how to comply with the law.
I understand, but you're talking to someone who's in a very rural agricultural community of 1,700 to 1,800 people, on a planning board of 3 people that just doesn't have the resources to submit to all of this on a regular basis.
If, most of your actions are type 2, you can just move past that, right? And if the type 1 actions are coming along, you can utilize the applicant's own funding to pay for whatever additional review or legal. If you would like to do a legal query, you can even charge that back to the applicant.
I'm sorry, say that last bit again. You broke up a little bit.
If you have like a legal question, I'm pretty sure that too can be finding out how the laws all interact for the specific applicant. You can ask your charge back the cost of that legal review to the applicant.
Okay, that's another process I'm not familiar with.
If you'd like, you can call the office and we can commiserate about cases where we've had to go through this process.
Sure.
And you might be able to reach out to the lawyers if you have additional questions about completing the forms. But
yeah, I just know whenever I have a planning board issue and I raise it up and I say we need to have a legal review, the first, like the entire board raises their hand and said, who's going to pay for it?
I'm pretty sure that we can pass that cost to the applicant, but we can ask our state person that we communicate with for making determinations on things like this.
But if I'm not talking about an applicant for a specific activity, I'm talking about a general review of the local planning and zoning land use regulations.
Okay.
That's a board function.
Okay, and so then they would have to pay.
No. That's an unfunded mandate.
Okay.
We are not going to pay for that.
I can't change the statute of New York state laws. We just have to do our best to work within them. So
I can't change the ruling of the board. I don't sit on the board of my local town. I only sit on the planning board.
Mm-hmm.
So I can tell them this is what's required, and they can say, no, we're not going to pay for it, and we're stuck. Because they say, we're not violating any environmental regulations. We're not impacting any environmental issues. Why do we need to do this?
So I have a question pertaining to what this gentleman is talking about. I am new to all this. I'm newly on a board here. But as far as filling out that form where he would say not applicable, wouldn't the purpose of filling it out be to sort of cover yourself should something arise in the future, and it wouldn't fall back that you never filled the form out, but that it would show that you did fill the form out, but something unforeseen came up that now it is applicable should something happen. At least it would be on record that you did your due diligence and filled out the form.
Right. In most cases, at least some of the questions are applicable. That's why we go through, and you're finding it. It's like a test with a high specificity. And sometimes you get a person where you get a situation where it's just not applicable, but a lot of other cases, you might have caught something is it going to generate a lot of trash? Does your community have a way of coping with that question? They're meant to be broadly thoughtful to make sure that most aspects of environmental review have been covered and thought about by the planning board.
I can understand the value of using the checklist as an internal mechanism. I just don't see the value of filing it at the higher level if we've filed it at our local level to say that we've considered it.
Are there any
Yeah,
other?
look, I was just gonna say, I'm looking at the chat to see if might be some other questions.
If there aren't any other questions, can anybody see my window, or are we still looking at the questions box?
Yep. Forgive me, but I tend to fall under the general principle of government is not the resolution of the problem, government is the problem.
So slightly unrelated to SEQR, our office has put out this survey. If you guys are on our MailChimp list, you probably got invited to complete the workforce or employer survey. I'm just trying to promote it. And we've got several hundred responses so far, but they're clustered in certain industries. So we're trying to broaden out the reach and get people who are involved in being a cashier or a waitress, people who are doing, everyday work, to go ahead and complete the survey about what they like in their job, what they look for in a new job, what kind of training they'd like to do. If you see this, think of me and try and complete the form. And then finally, we have another training on auditing in December. So you're going to get an invitation to that one shortly, but it's not particularly planning and zoning. It's not going to generate planning and zoning credit. I have the list of who's attended and some phone numbers. So I'll email the credit sheet to everybody. And then you can download it, you sign it, and then you submit it to your own community for record keeping. Any questions about the credit form that you'll be getting, in the next week? Any other suggestions for class material that you'd like to hear more about? Go ahead and email me. Thanks for coming today. Attendance was really good.
Thanks, everyone.